So there will be a recording question there for y'all. All right, let me bring that book up. All right.
Okay.
Pardon.
So I'm presenting my senior thesis titled Out of This World, a transformed sense of self through encountering and becoming other in portal fantasy. And as you might be able to tell by the title, I am focusing on the genre of portal fantasy. And specifically, I'm looking at how portal fantasy deals with the relationship between self and other. Self being our own self-image as an individual or community, and other being those we view as different, as strange, or as opposite to ourselves, either as an individual or as a community. And I chose the genre of portal fantasy literature because it's one of the most recognized subgenres of fantasy literature, which in general is a very popular genre of reading today for people. But as a genre, fantasy literature has long been questioned as a meaningful literary form, both by academia, who views it as which has viewed it as more of a low form of literature, and by parents who worry that fantasy fiction for their children is merely an extreme form of escapism with little practical translation into real life. And let me be the first to say that there are issues with portal fantasy, and I'll be looking at this more closely in a moment, how portal fantasy's history of development is connected with imperialism and colonialism. And so portal fantasy has a tendency to present the Western white world as the superior self in opposition to the fantastical inferior other. However, I am proposing that the very nature of portal fantasy and the root of these issues of how the relationship between self and other is presented has the potential to subvert rather than support these ideas of self being superior. And I've analyzed two works, two by C.S. Lewis and then also two works by Deanna Wynne Jones, who are both very popular authors in the fantasy genre for readers of all ages, and they demonstrate this opportunity of portal fantasy by providing their characters and readers with an out of this world, hence my title, or an out of body experience, an adventure, with the result of giving their characters and readers a new perception of themselves and of their reality. So for this presentation, I will be giving just a brief look at the history of portal fantasy and some of the issues there, and then look at a few examples of how Lewis and Jones use the genre of portal fantasy to engage with the question of how individuals see themselves and other. And both Lewis and Jones, they move beyond a feel-good magical adventure, and they allow their characters and readers to both encounter and to become the other, an experience which can deconstruct the sense of self as superior and combat those binary oppositions and social constructions which can be so ingrained in one's view of self and other. So to begin with, what is portal fantasy? As the name suggests, portal fantasy are those stories in which characters from the real world can travel to a fantasy world through some sort of a portal. Think the Pevensies traveling through the wardrobe and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or Alice traveling through the rabbit hole in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And what's significant about portal fantasy is that it allows the characters of the real world and the real world in reality as we know it to exist alongside of a fantasy world. And so because of that, portal fantasies are characterized by the clash between the normalcy of the real world and the strangeness of the fantasy other world. And this aspect of portal fantasy is what scholars Levy and Mendelsohn have described as the tourist narrative, meaning portal fantasies set up the story for readers to tour the fantasy world and to experience those differences of the other world in relation to themselves. And this means that by nature of portal fantasy, which brings characters from one world to another world, there will be encounters and relationships between self and other. And unfortunately, the history of portal fantasy is very connected with imperialism and colonialism, particularly as the fantasy genre was becoming really popular in between the world wars in the 20th century. Books were actually being sent from Britain to the colonies to help teach British national identity. And scholar Maria Sassier specifically links the works by J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis with white supremacy. And she argues that the spread of children's fantasy helped to establish Britain as a seat of global enchantment and associate white, good magic, with racial whiteness in the minds of young people across the Anglo-American world and beyond. And Tolkien and Lewis were very influential kind of founding fathers of fantasy literature as we know it today. And they really influenced all the fantasy that has followed after their books. And so there's a shift in the conventions of portal fantasy to become these stories in which humans, generally the white Western world, are acting as the heroes and the saviors and the colonial rulers of the fantasy world. And this results in what Mendelssohn calls the stranger/savior politics of modern portal fantasies. The fantasy world becomes centered around the protagonists from this world. So again, the Western, often white protagonist from our world is needed to put things right in the fantasy world. And as a result, the relationship between the characters of the real world and the characters of the fantasy world can often parallel the way that the Western view can view other cultures as needing an outside savior. So clearly, portal fantasy does have issues. But if we break down these issues to the source of the problem, then at the root of portal fantasy's development, along with colonialism and imperialism, is the issue of the representation of self and other. Because the relationship of self and other has so long been based on binary oppositions and comparisons of value, such as men versus women, white versus non-white, the relationship between self and other becomes one of superiority versus inferiority. And we start running into hierarchies and feeling like self is innately better than other. And these hierarchies and oppositions can be seen in a lot of portal fantasy, such as with the tourist narrative. So rather than viewing the fantasy world and inhabitants as existing for themselves, portal fantasy turns them into objects, either glamorous and exotic or dangerous and evil, to be experienced by the characters from the real world. With that being said, for the same reason that portal fantasy has been dangerous in supporting these views, portal fantasy also has the potential to subvert the ideas of self as being innately the hero and the savior, and other as innately the villain and the ones needing to be saved. Because if the problems of portal fantasy stem from these encounters between self and other, in which the other is seen as an inferior object, and then these very encounters, if dealt with correctly by authors, can lead to the personal transformation of readers and equip them to examine their own views of themselves and of other. Philosopher and sociologist George Mead writes that the experience necessary to help break down the idealized superior sense of self is the experience of seeing oneself from the perspective of other. And he asked this question, how can an individual get outside himself experientially in such a way as to become an object to himself? So that's the question that we need to ask ourselves to give us this experience of seeing ourselves from the perspective of other. And portal fantasy is actually a perfect answer to this question, because portal fantasy can literally take an individual outside of themselves by giving their characters an out-of-body or out-of-this-world experience. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I focused on 2 works by C.S. Lewis, which were The Voyage of the Dawn Treader and Out of the Silent Planet, and then 2 works by Diana Wynne Jones, Howl's Moving Castle and The Dark Lord of Dirkholm, to see how these authors used portal fantasy to deal productively with the relationship between self and other. And across their 4 works, I've identified 3 levels of interaction between self and other that all lead to some sort of transformed perspective of the readers or characters' ideas of their worlds, of themselves, and of other. And I don't have time to look at each level in each work, but I'm going to look at a few examples. So the first level that I identified in their works is a slightly more superficial level, but still very beneficial. It's using characters' encounters with others to re-enchant their idea of reality of this world. So basically, this is, the readers that come from our world, our real world, the aspects of reality can become mundane and boring to us. And so the fantasy world becomes this very magical and exciting and new experience for them. But one of the lessons that characters are able to learn through portal fantasy is that their own real world can be just as exciting and magical. It's just a matter of perspective and a matter of noticing and looking for and noticing those magical aspects. And one of the works that shows us really well is by Diana Wynne Jones. Howl's Moving Castle has a character, the main character is Sophie, and she actually has the opportunity to travel through a portal. She's a character from the fantasy world, and she travels to the real world, to the reader's world. And while she's in our world, she is just amazed by all things that readers would view as normal. So for example, computers and televisions, to the readers, it's just normal technology. To Sophie, who's from the fantasy world, she views them as magic boxes with magic colored pictures on the front. And so the readers get the chance to see their world from a new perspective of the other, from the fantasy world. And this first level of encounter between self and other then helps to remind readers that perspective is always important, and what may be mundane and boring to one person is actually magical to another. However, this first level, I call it superficial because it doesn't engage very meaningfully with how characters view themselves and how they view others. And so that's the second level I found across Lewis and Jones's works. They both use magic provided by the fantasy world to physically transform their characters into someone or something other. So not only do the characters encounter other, they also become the other. And this is just the saying that you need to walk in someone else's shoes. In portal fantasy, that can literally be done. Characters can literally be transformed into someone else and to get a new experience in someone else's shoes or something else's shoes. And what's important about this experience of becoming someone or something else is that it allows the person to see their own selves, their previous selves, from the perspective of the other. So in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader by C.S. Lewis, one of the characters from the real world who travels to Narnia is Eustace, and he has a view of himself. He thinks he's very advanced. He thinks he's very superior to everyone else, but really he's just a very bratty, annoying little boy. And while he's in Narnia, he's transformed into a dragon. And it's while he's a dragon in his experience of being an other, of being a beast as opposed to a human, that he's able to reflect on himself as a boy and get a truer perspective of his actual character as a boy. And so his shift of perspective of himself, it's not just when he first realizes that he's become a dragon, but it's actually when he reflects as a dragon on his previous self and when he reflects on how others will now see him. So he grows in self-awareness about his true character through the experience of being other and reflecting on his self as a boy. And he realizes that he's not such a nice person as he had always supposed. So that experience of physically stepping outside of himself as the primary subject of his reality, and then being able to view himself actually as an object or as an other, that leads to that transformation of character for Eustace. And it's so profound that when he returns home after being returned to a boy and returns home from Narnia, the people there talk about how you would never know him for the same boy. Then, so that's the second level of relationship between self and other, which focuses on the character transformation, physically transforming a character into another. The third level that Lewis and Jones use in their portal fantasies is to switch the encounter between self and other in a way that more directly involves the readers. So this is a way in which the readers themselves can become the others. And this is done by, instead of presenting the humans, which would include both the characters and the readers from the real world, instead of presenting them as normal or the good or the hero, which is what a lot of portal fantasies set up the human characters to be, Lewis and Jones make the humans the strange and even the evil and the villains of the story. In C.S. Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet, the character Ransom is kidnapped by two other humans on Earth, and he's taken to the planet Mars, which is called Malacandra by the natives. And this is before, space travel was a thing when Lewis wrote this book. However, in the relationship between the humans of our world and then the other, the species of Malacandra, the humans are not by any means the savior of the story or the superior ones. And actually, there are multiple scenes that show how the humans are the ones behind the times as far as ideas of equality and of getting along with each other. Because on Malacandra, there are 3 intelligent species, and they all live peacefully together. And they're all very shocked to hear the stories of the wars and death and destruction on Earth between humans. And then additionally, although Ransom fears that the Malacandrians are going to be the violent ones, and then Weston and Devine, who are the 2 kidnappers, they view the Malacandrians as very primitive in opposition to the human civilized selves. The first act of violence is committed by the humans. Weston murders one of the Malacandrians, and Lewis writes this scene in a very interesting way. He writes, "Ransom is deafened by a loud sound, a perfectly familiar sound, which was the last thing he expected to hear. It was a terrestrial, human, and civilized sound. It was even European. It was the crack of an English rifle." So by linking Weston's murder of one of the Malacandrians with the words perfectly familiar, human and civilized, even European, Lewis is undermining the expectations of the human's role in the fantastical otherworld. The civilized, perfectly familiar humans are the villains of the story. And so readers get to see themselves as the dangerous other rather than as the savior or the superior self. Similarly, in Diana Wynne Jones' work, The Dark Lord of Dirkholm, the ultimate villain of the story is not actually an evil Dark Lord from the fantasy world, but Mr. Chesney, who is a human from the reader's world, who forces the magical world to enact farcical fantasy adventures for human tourists from our world to experience. So Mr. Chesney is a capitalist businessman using the fantasy world's culture and their life as an exotic adventure for the humans. And Jones tells this story from the perspective of the fantasy world rather than our world. So the readers, as humans, their characters, if they were in the story, they would actually be the human tourists who are causing the trouble for the magical world, but they also get to see firsthand from the perspective of the fantasy world that destruction that the human tourists are causing. So the magical world is being ruined by the tourists. The towns are being ransacked, their crops are being trampled, and countless inhabitants are actually being killed because they're forced to take part in these dramatized battles so that the humans can feel like they've had a real adventure. And the humans don't recognize that the inhabitants of the magical world are more than just an exotic experience or object for the human's pleasure. And so the entire story sets up the real evil to be the exploitative mentality that Mr. Chesney and the human world and the readers hold towards the other, those who are different. In the story, it's a fantastical other. In real life, it might be a social or cultural other. And so the readers get to see how evil and destructive it is when we view others as just objects with that tourist mindset. And at one point, Mr. Chesney sums up really well the view that self tends to hold of other. He says to another human about the fantasy world, "You don't understand, he's not real life. None of these people are. If they didn't happen to be under contract to me, they'd be nothing." Mr. Chesney's belief here reflects both the tendency of portal fantasy to make the other world's existence dependent on the human world, and it reflects our tendency to forget that the others of the world, those who belong to a different country, culture, social class, are just as much the cells and subjects of their own experience of reality as we are. And in fact, to them, we are the other, not the self or our own subject. So both Lewis and Jones's portal fantasies then give readers roles as humans from the real world, roles that are not glorified self or savior or hero, but rather the role of intruder and of other and even the villain. And it's this experience of seeing oneself from the perspective of other and so becoming the other that paves the way for readers to reject their idealized sense of self, which posits itself against an inferior other. In summary, then, there are definite problems with portal fantasy, and there's that big tendency to perpetuate the colonialist and imperialist roots of portal fantasy. But since those problems center around the issue of the role of self and other, portal fantasy also has the opportunity to deal with these encounters in a way that dismantles rather than supports the ingrained perceptions about and those binary oppositions between self and other. In the clash between realities and worlds and characters, portal fantasy provides an ideal space for readers to both encounter and to become the other. And that leads them to grapple with the really important question of how in real life they might be viewing themselves through idealized eyes, and how they might be considering those around them as others and objects rather than their own subjects and selves. And so in conclusion, Lewis and Jones's works, they prove that rather than being an escapist genre with little practical translation into the real world, portal fantasy is uniquely capable of drawing readers and characters physically out of their own world and their way of viewing things, then transforming them literally and metaphorically, and then also returning them to their reality with a changed perception of themselves and of other. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. That was great. All right. Let's it looks like we've already got a couple of questions in the chat, but let's hear Frankie's presentation, and then we'll start firing away. I'm not trying to freak anybody out. No, we're going to ask real nicely. All right, Frankie.
Hello, I'm Franklin Pennington, and I will be doing a presentation on Stephen King's stories of The Shining, Pet Sematary, and Misery, based off of the corruption of the characters in the main stories. If you're a fan of Stephen King, then you know that he tends to use characters that are products of their own failure. He takes completely ordinary characters, ones with flaws, ambitions, and emotion, and he twists their personalities into something that is completely different and unimaginable to their original self. This happens when given the right opportunity, condition, or influence. With how often he uses this trope, you start to see patterns emerge and get an idea of what King is trying to do. By using such realistic characters, King is showing that anyone can be susceptible to corruption of the heart and beliefs when the influence by the before mentioned catalysts are introduced. The main characters of each story start to have drastic changes and begin their descent into madness and self-destruction. Changes of the mental health, having violent or aggressive outbursts, experiences of experiencing addictive or obsessive behaviors, and lastly, having the desire for control over something or someone. The characters that fall into these behaviors are Jack Torrance from The Shining, Louis Creed from Pet Sematary, and Annie Wilkes, the #1 fan of Misery. By looking at their personalities before the influencing force, we can get an idea of who they were, and what motivated them, what they want for themselves and for the people around them. When the influencing device is introduced, we can look at their personalities and how they become altered, and their motives and actions start to reflect on the influence device. To start off with, Jack Torrance is a very complicated man. Jack comes from a cycle of family abuse. His father was an abusive drunk, and in turn, it caused Jack to follow in his footsteps. This cycle is represented in chapter 14 of The Shining, when Jack is being punished by a neighbor for playing with matches. Jack in turn throws stones at passing cars, and when his father catches him, he, quote, reddens Jack's behind and then blackens his eye. We can see here that Jack's father takes punishment a little too far. And it's only instills in Jack's young mind that violence tends to be the only outlet for his aggressions. Because later on in that chapter, Jack finds a stray dog and he ends up kicking it into the streets. All of this becomes normal to Jack. He has issues with fights in grade school and tends to use aggression as the only means to achieve what he wants. We also see the reflection of his father's actions when he turns to punishing his own son. When he finds out that Danny, his son, had gotten into his papers in his workspace, he accidentally, quote unquote, accidentally breaks his arm. Thus, Jack goes from the abused victim to the abuser himself. And Jack's anger doesn't just extend to his family. It's actually the reason for his termination from his career, from his job, when he finds one of his students vandalizing his own car. With his past history of childhood trauma and his own struggle with alcohol and his own temper, it's really no surprise that he fell victim to his own catalyst. Which brings into question what his catalyst was. Well, when Jack accepts a job as caretaker for the Overlook Hotel, he stumbles upon an old scrapbook that has the history of the hotel all in one volume. And he starts to become obsessed with the history. The idea, he becomes obsessed with the history of the hotel, and it kind of inspires him to want to write about it. The idea of writing this book seems to dominate his mind, even to the point that he calls up his employer to inquire about the true owner of the hotel. This in turn gets him in trouble and potentially puts his job at risk. This starts to fall into the behavior of obsession. The more that Jack learns about the hotel's history, the more he needs to be a part of it. His dependency on the scrapbook and learning about the Overlook becomes very similar to his dependency on alcohol, which can be seen when his wife comes to check up on him. He starts almost guiltily, as if he had been drinking secretly, and she could smell the fumes on him. It's ridiculous. He scrubbed his lips and with his hand and called back. In this section, Jack is substituting his drinking habits for the scrapbook. It's being compromised as something that is wrong and needs to be kept hidden from his wife. The obsession with the scrapbook also awakens some other obsessions in him. Jack begins to feel as though he was chosen by the hotel to do something great, that he could become worthy of upper management. In order to achieve this new goal of his, the hotel uses the ghost of the previous caretaker to influence Jack's needs to handle his family. The ghost that comes to Jack is quoted saying, "A man who cannot control his family holds very little interest to our manager. A man who cannot guide the course of his own wife and son can hardly be expected to guide himself, let alone assume a position of responsibility in an operation of this magnitude." By insinuating that Jack cannot take care of his own, cannot control his own wife and child, also makes the assumption that he cannot control his own self, and that he is unworthy of meeting or even becoming this manager figure. So obsession with wanting to win the manager's favor then goes into the need of control for his family. Jack sees them as a hindrance on his potential success. And the way that Jack tries to control his family is by leads into the next part of the indoctrination process. In Jack's eyes, there's only one way to resolve the problem, and that is to get rid of his family, or as he calls it, giving him their medicine. It's at this moment that Jack reaches the point I like to call the point of no return, as in a critical moment that he loses himself as this underlying force takes control over his psyche. By breaking that last tie into his old self, Jack is free to take his place as manager and fully achieve his twisted desires. And that is to be the bigger part of the Overlook. Now, keep in mind that Jack Torrance wasn't exactly a horrible person. He did have his issues and he did make mistakes just like the rest of us, but he actually did try to work past them. He went to AA meetings, he gave up drinking, he begged his wife for a second chance to be with him and to prove that he is trying to become a better man. It wasn't until the introduction of the scrapbook and the influences of being this bigger part other than himself, that he starts to fall back into his old behaviors and becoming the self that he didn't want to be. Before the catalyst is introduced, there has to be an incident of violence or a predisposal to violent tendencies. Once this is established, the catalyst can be identified. This catalyst will then induce obsessive behaviors and are combined with the need of control over something or someone, with the final step being the destruction of what the person valued most. Now that the pattern has been established for how the characters can become twisted to serve their alternative desires, we can begin to look at Lewis Creed to see how this thought process can be applied to him. Like Jack Torrance, Lewis Creed has father issues. His, however, comes from the absence of a father figure. Without a proper father figure to guide Lewis in life, Lewis looks to his neighbor Lud to take up that mantle. He takes joy in listening to the stories Lud tells him about the history of Maine, and the two men become closer as they spend their evenings sharing the occasional beer with one another and swapping stories of their life experiences. Not only this, but Lewis also tries to be a better father for his own son. There's even a moment where Lewis is by himself with his son Gage while he's laying in his crib. The two share a very touching moment. He went to his son, and because there was no one there to see him do it, not even Rachel, he kissed his fingers and pressed them lightly and briefly to Gage's cheek through the bars of the crib. The fact that Lewis acts so tenderly around Gage just shows how much love he does have for his son. But the fact that he has to do this action in private, where no one can see him, indicates that he doesn't have that knowledge of how to express his love in a proper way. That there's almost this taboo of showing affection when others are around. Lewis is also a very logic-oriented man. He believes in rationality rather than the supernatural. To him, anything can be explained with rational reasoning. Take, for instance, chapter 25 of Pet Sematary, when the family cat Church was killed by a passing truck. Lewis and Lud take the cat to the Micmac burial grounds, and they erect a cairn for him. And even though Lud just tells him, "We just buried your cat, there's nothing else to it," Lewis is a bit skeptical. Well, when the cat returns the following morning, Lewis is unnerved and shocked that the cat essentially came back to life. But then he starts to think of possibilities. He plays with the idea that Church was simply stunned by the truck and wasn't actually killed at all. But even when he's faced with the logicals in his theory, such as the way that the cat's head was twisted when they found his body, or the fact that the blood was still stuck to the whiskers, or the fact that he weighed different, he weighed more when he was dead than when he was alive. He kind of just brushes this all off as him being an expert on people and not animals. He was a doctor, not a vet. He had made a misdiagnosis. That was all. He tries to reassure himself that it was just a simple mistake, but even he knows that there's something different about the cat. It's actually due to the cat's death that we can see the catalyst for the story. As I mentioned before, they buried the cat at the Micmac burial grounds. And the burial ground becomes the influencer that will cause a lot more heartache for Lewis and his family. The cat isn't the only victim in the story. In a warm spring afternoon, Gage, again, Lewis's son, wanders off and gets hit by a massive hauling truck, killing him instantly. This moment brings a lot of grief to Lewis. He blames himself for the death of his son. He keeps saying that he should have been there. He should have been keeping an eye on him. He should have been faster to get him. Even though no one else blames the blame on him, he himself takes out the responsibility that it was his fault. And with the grief, it Because of his grief, it kind of compromises his ability to reason. And pretty soon, he subconsciously thinks, what would happen if he buried Gage at the Micmac burial grounds? And you start to see this, this obsession whenever he asks Ludd about it, if anyone had buried a human there. And Ludd warns him that it's a terrible idea, that he just needs to let Gabe rest, that whatever he's thinking, it cannot be better than where Gabe is already at. But he starts to fascinate with the concept of reanimating the dead. A writer for the Journal of Popular Culture, Patrick McClear, actually brings up a very interesting point about Lewis's obsession. Lewis Creed is placed within a fragile position of power, represented by Creed's access to the Micmac burial grounds and thus the ability to raise the dead of his choosing. This newfound ability is alongside with his personal guilt and grief becomes a terrible combination that further drives Lewis's decision to bring back his son. There is only one problem in the way, and again, it's the family. Very similar to The Shining, the family becomes a hindrance to the father figure's actions. And in both cases, the family is used as a barrier for the two men to achieve their ultimate goal. The family in this case are used to play as a part of reason, and it's the last connection to the men's humanity. Once they're taken out of the equation, just about anything can happen. Without that connection to humanity, Lewis starts to mentally break down. There's even implications that the Micmac might actually be influencing him by making it impossible to recall his son's face and to completely blow off all the warnings that he got from both Ludd and from Pascal, a man he tried to save earlier in the story. What kept him going on this insane scheme was the prospect of seeing his son once more. Lewis buries Gage in the Micmac cemetery, and this is the point of no return for him. It unleashes an evil that will ruin everything, that Lewis held dear to him, thus delving him into the final stages of the corruption. The zombified version of Gage manages to kill Judd, the man that Lewis sought as a surrogate father figure, and also kill his wife, Rachel, who he held in high regards. And with the death of both of these characters, Lewis realizes the error of his ways and has to take matters back into his own hands and kill his son once more. This moment when Lewis has to undo everything he has set in motion just shows the last remnants of his mind, the part that still has the ability to comprehend right and wrong, are still active in him, giving him one last shot to put Gage to rest once more. This moment of clarity doesn't last much longer, however, because once Lewis does put down his son, it's almost as if the Micmac is back in control, and it's compelling him to now bury his deceased wife. And he uses the reasoning of she had just passed away. Gage has been dead for a while, and that's why it didn't work. Because his wife had just died, he can quickly bury her, and it'll be like she never passed on. And Lewis, in the end, falls victim to his catalyst and destroys his family. And the once logic and reason-thinking man has turned into a crumbled shell of who he once was. This just leaves Annie Wilkes. Annie Wilkes is an ex-nurse who cared for Paul Sheldon once he was involved in a car accident. Annie comes off as a bit of a bit daft, childlike. She uses phrases such as cocky doodle, poppycock, just childlike phrases that no grown person would usually use. And she just honestly comes off as a dimwit. She is, however, extremely perceptive and doesn't let the smallest detail get past her. Even though Paul takes note that she is crazy, especially when she starts winking like a pig when she's talking about her pet hog she named Misery, he knows that there's something not right with her. She's still able to acclimate to normal civilization. She's able to go into town and run her errands. She's able to interact with people, and she doesn't necessarily draw attention to herself. It doesn't take much to take the seemingly normal woman and have her show her true colors when given the correct opportunity. Annie's catalyst, as the previous characters that have been discussed, must originate from some violent event. And this event comes in the form of Paul Shelby's car accident that happened in the middle of a snowstorm while he was intoxicated. The catalyst itself is Paul Shelby, or Sheldon, sorry. When Annie discovers that her hero is in her care, she goes completely over the moon. She's ecstatic. Paul, on the other hand, finds himself completely helpless at the mercy of some stranger who claims to be his #1 fan, as if he hasn't heard that one before. It's more than easy for Anne to have control over him. The way that she keeps control over Paul is by having him addicted to painkillers called Novril. In the text itself, Paul compares Annie and the pills to the moon and the tide. She was the moon, and she had brought the tide, which could cover the pillings being his pain. She brought them towards his mouth, which he immediately dropped open, and then she withdrew them. The fact that she's pulling the capsules away in an almost teasingly way, it shows that she knows she's in control. She has the upper hand. She has the ability to take away his pain at any given notice, so long as he's willing to cooperate with her. And she uses other means of violence as a way to keep control over Paul. To keep him bedridden, she actually mutilates his legs whenever he shows any sign of resistance towards her. And when he doesn't seem to want to write a new misery story to her specification. This ties into the obsessive behavior that comes with this catalyst. She idolizes Paul and the work that he created. She has the power to get him to write whatever it is she wants, and he potentially has no say in anything. This obsession she has for the Misery series will also be her downfall. Paul uses her own infatuations against her by writing the perfect Misery story. He ties up the loose ends. He answers the questions that she was longing to ask. It's essentially the end all of Paul Shelby books. And in his own words, it's the best Misery book, and it's the best Misery books, and maybe the best thing I ever wrote, mongrel or not. And when he has the most prized possession in his hands, he sets it on fire as a way to hurt Annie and to get her attention drawn towards the novel itself and not on him. And while her attention is diverted, he uses the typewriter that she provided him, and she strikes her over the head. Then he forces himself on top of her, and he forces the story down her throat. And in doing so, it's giving the control back to him. It's him reclaiming his life, his own free will, that he is no longer under the influence of her. And the scene that he is forcing himself onto her, and it's very reminiscent to an earlier scene in the story where Annie is giving Paul CPR. She forced her air into him, and in Paul's mind, he was becoming infected with her breath. And by forcing his final misery book down her throat, he claims back his own life, and he overpowered his captor. Annie's own obsessions, along with her mental instability, became enhanced when she had her hero in her midst. And she wanted to essentially destroy what she loved most on her own terms. And if Paul didn't outplay her, she would have most likely succeeded. Whether it's the alcoholic father that is Jack Torrance, or the grief-stricken father that is Louis Creed, or even the mentally unstable nurse that is Anne Wilkes, Stephen King is able to create characters that feel real, feel alive, and feel genuine. And by introducing influences of obsession, violence, or control, each character falls into the same indoctrination and devastation to those that they loved. And by King writing such intricate characters, he's showing us that the human heart can and will be easily changed when presented with the right conditions. It's only a matter of figuring out what those conditions are. Thank you.
Thank you, Frankie. Okay, let's see. All right. Any questions for our speakers? All right. Well, let me give you all some time to think a bit more, because I do have I want to start with Maria, because Maria talked about the concept of the exotic, which can, the way you discuss it, I thought was really interesting. When you brought it up, and then some of the things you said towards the end, because the exotic, I think, is oftentimes seen as, kind of something that's kind of cool, that's interesting, that's different. But I think with the exotic, we oftentimes want to control it. Okay, when we encounter the exotic, we put it in zoos. When we encounter the exotic, we sometimes fetishize it. When we encounter the exotic in foods, we appropriate it for our own purposes. So talk a bit more about the role of the exotic in these portal fantasies. Like I said, I think you started down this road, but talk a little bit more specifically in terms of how you see the role of the exotic in these stories.
Yeah, so specifically in the last work I was talking about, The Dark Lord of Dirkholm, that whole book, the author set up to really critique the way that a lot of portal fantasy turns the fantasy world into an exotic adventure. And so it's something that I think there's a line between appreciating the differences of somebody and then trying to take that as something that just turns them into an object to be experienced by yourself or your subject. So in the portal fantasy, the humans, it is literally, they can't see, the tourists who are going there, they can't see that the magical inhabitants, the inhabitants of the magical world, they don't view them as real people because they have so turned them into, this is something for me to experience, this is for my own pleasure. Like, okay, they've got magic, that's super cool. They've got dark lords and evil villains, that's super cool. I'm going to come and I'm going to experience for myself, and then I'm going to go home, and that was going to be great for me. But they don't recognize that that has real consequences for the other people. So I think it's really interesting, although the author she was critiquing the genre of portal fantasy, to be honest, but it's also a translation into just the way that I think a lot of Americans have a tendency to view other cultures and travels to other places as just a really cool, oh, it's a spring break, it's a summer trip, I'm going to go here, I'm going to experience this other culture, I'm going to post pictures on Instagram, look how cool I am. Then you come back and then that's that. And it's not that it's not that realization that these are real people. Like, this is their life, this is their reality, and it's not just something cool that's to be posted on Instagram and to be taken lightly. So in the portal fantasy, one of the reasons I want to focus on that is because by reading about other about the other in that way, even if it's just the fantasy world. It kind of just puts that in that mindset that anytime we experience something cool and different and that is exciting to us, that's okay, because it is going to be exciting to us. But there's also that danger if we turn it into, it's exciting just for me and I don't have to worry about what's going on behind the picture here, and I don't have to worry about how my action of experiencing them is affecting them.
So let me ask a follow-up real quick, and then I want to get to others, because that I was also thinking of, you use the term tourist, right, a few times, and I think it's a great word because, you know, this makes me think of a class I had, a reading circle class I had a couple weeks ago, where we were talking about tourists, and one of my students is from Las Vegas, and so tourists, particularly in places like Las Vegas, have obviously a very positive sort of role in terms of bringing so much money into the city, but also they're just there to sort of get their kicks and do a bunch of dumb crap and then leave the city with their problems sometimes. So yeah, I think that's a good approach and a good term to use, and it connects just to what you're saying about the exotic too. Trisha, question.
So not a question, but more of a connection. It almost reminds me of the overlay photography that you see done specifically of tourists visiting Auschwitz and some of the Holocaust memorials in Europe, where they are posting pictures of Instagram of them standing on the rail trail, the railroad ties, or near the crematoriums or whatever. And there's an artist, and please forgive me, I can't remember who it is, but they have overlaid American or tourists, not necessarily Americans, but any tourists that are taking these carefree, go lucky pictures and overlaying them on the horrors of the Holocaust. And that these aren't, you're not here visiting and having fun, although you are, there is really a connection to a something that's more significant. And so what she's saying really kind of makes me think of, we're not just tourists visiting, or we're not just experiencing, but what you're experiencing is the reality of that culture or the fantasy world or the whatever it is, whether it's in literature or through that piece. So kind of interesting how that can all connect, that we should be taking something away from it and owning it and changing who we are, but not just seeing it from a surface level. And I think you can get that out of the literature piece versus that was just the connection I made in terms of other areas. I'm not familiar with the literature that she's reading, but I might become familiar with it now that she's talked about it.
Yeah, so yeah, Kelly, I can read what you posted. Okay, yeah, so Dr. Walter Carding was asking about time travel fiction in relation to the works you were discussing, Maria. So she talks about how a person from the present time is inserted into another time. You can obviously see the parallel there. Do you think your analysis of the portal fantasy could apply similarly to time travel fiction? Octavia Butler's Kindred, if you've read that.
So I've not read that work. Hi, Dr. Walter Carney.
Hey,
And
how
I'm
are you?
good, thank you. I'm actually not very familiar with a lot of time travel fiction, but one thing that made me think of is there's a tendency of portal fantasy to focus on medieval time period. So kind of if that connects with the idea of traveling to a different time period, particularly medieval time periods, that goes back to the British national identity of like, oh, these good old times with all the castles and the knights and this and that. So I think time travel fiction could possibly be interesting to look at kind of that portrayal that they have, which time period they're going to, and what's their portrayal of that, if they're kind of glossing over the not so good part. So I like earlier today, the good, the bad, and ugly. Is it just focusing on the good, or is it using it productively to kind of say, look, there were some issues here. There were these problems of how people were treating each other. There's these inequalities and injustices. And so one of the works that I read for the portal fantasy was specifically looking at issues with medieval portal fantasy. And that's the kind of, particularly C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, they really pushed that genre and focusing on monsters and the dragons and Beowulf and all this. but it's such a celebration of British culture and lords and all of that. And there's some not so great parts about that with serfdom and inequalities and prejudice and racism and people taking over other people and all of that. So I think it could definitely, time travel would probably be something, the time travel fiction. I bet there's a lot of that where they're going back to a time period to experience it as something cool, but not recognizing what it was really like and what dangers there might be in glorifying that time period today.
Kindred in particular is really interesting on this point because the protagonist is a contemporary. It's written and takes place primarily in the mid-1970s, but she's a contemporary African-American woman who's transported back in time to save an ancestor of hers whenever he is threatened with death. And it is the white man who owned her family when they were enslaved. And so she is interacting with that world, sort of a personal connection to the boy, and he grows up to be a man who she has the responsibility for rescuing so that she can be born. But also she has to act as though she herself is enslaved. And at one point, her white husband returns with her through mechanisms, right, as you get in these books. And he's sort of like, wow, this is kind of interesting, right? He wants to become the time traveling tourist, the Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court kind of thing. And she's like, no, you're wrong. This is, there are children over there who are playing at selling one another as slaves. And so it's very interesting to me how what you were talking about the experience of the person from the past from the other world visiting the ordinary world. We don't get that in a lot of time travel, but we do have in this book, Dana, the protagonist, acculturates a bit to the past, and when she returns to the present, she brings that mindset with her. She looks at a fountain pen for an hour just trying to figure out how such a crazy thing even came to be invented. And so yeah, just thinking of your theoretical framework could interestingly apply in some other genres, but there's a lot of there's some interesting neo-slave narrative time travel texts out there. But that, yeah, okay.
Yeah,
Ask Franklin is supposed to have read it, I believe. Franklin, yeah.
Franklin is supposed to have read it.
Okay.
And I'm seeing a lot of kindred source material in Lovecraft country. If you'll watch that, it's that was a great show. Check it out. Okay, any other questions? All right, Frankie, I have a question. All right, I think you made some interesting points in relation to control, addiction, some of the other specific elements. How about, because something else that I want to hear more about is, what about this concept or idea of the hero complex? What do you think about that? How do you think that applies to the three texts that you talked about?
Well, with the hero complex, I think it can be mostly applied to Jack Torrance and Lewis Creed more, because of course they are put in the role of the breadwinner, the paternal caretaker of their families. And with Jack Torrance, it's kind of like a last-ditch effort to make something of himself so that he can prove both to himself and to his family that he's more than an alcoholic, abusive drunk. And I think that does also tie into the whole obsession with needing to be more than what he is, and how that can also contribute to his downward spiral. As for Lewis Creed, playing with the hero mentality, he again blames himself for his son's death. He blames himself because he wasn't fast enough to catch him. He wasn't paying as much attention to him, even though his daughter and his wife didn't put any blame on him, even though his neighbor was like, this is in no way, shape, or form your fault, he still feels like he wronged his son and that his life was cut short. And that if he can just bring him back, If the Micmac burial ground can bring him back, he can essentially restore what was taken away from him in a way. Because it not only just affected him, it also affected his wife, because his wife was taking the death of their child extremely hard, and that this can help both himself and her getting back their child.
Yeah, so all right. Those were great connections. So let's think about misery. Let's think about maybe not a lot, but I would say some authors, especially very popular authors, having sort of a hero complex, with their popularity. I think that's a character that you see sometimes in movies about authors, particularly male authors. And I don't know, Annie is interesting, right? Like she keeps calling herself #1 fan, so there might be something there too.
I think in a way she views that she is helping Paul,
Right,
because he wants to kill off misery, his best-selling character.
Yeah.
Anytime he writes a misery story, it sells, like it's always a bestseller. But he wanted to be done with misery. He wanted to move on to something else, and she pretty much stops him.
Yeah.
Not only that, but she destroys the only manuscript of his latest novel that he wanted to publish, and she forces him to give his best effort. And whenever he tries to use like a slight cop out or a Deus Ex Machina, she calls him out on it. And she's like, "No, you're Paul Sheldon. You're better than this. You can do better."
Okay.
Even though she does torture him and withdraw his medication, break
Throw that in there.
tables,
Yeah.
Isn't that a hero complex? Doesn't she see herself as the hero because she is saving the story? That's who she's really saving. She's not really saving Paul Sheldon, but by forcing him and taking care of, quote unquote, him, or not taking care of him and causing him to be an invalid, she is the hero of her world, of the story that she wants to continue. So, I mean, there is some hero complex there, but in a very different light than the other two characters in the other two books.
Which brings gender into it, right? The two characters that are initially understood to be hero are acting in a way that conforms to the patriarchy. And there's an implied critique, right? Because they're trying to be the big patriarch and it results in murder and mayhem. And she's trying to be the maternal figure, the caring figure, and also violence and murder and mayhem.
Murder and mayhem.
Yeah. And so we've got a notion of different types of heroism for men or for women. But in either case, their conformity to type is part of what, part of what pushes them over the edge. It enables them to rationalize that they're doing absolutely the best thing possible for these poor people, when in fact, that's not actually the case. So,
I mean, I don't know. I
don't
kept giving him medicine, right? I mean,
gender roles will kill you sooner or later. They'll drive you mad.
Amen.
So interesting, very interesting either way, though. I mean, I think that that notion of the hero in these three books is definitely not what you would typically identify as the hero. They're certainly not Superman and Marvel comic heroes. They definitely have the original author, you got to look at his background. He definitely does not write from the Superman ideals of superheroes. So but they have the elements of a hero. I mean, what makes the hero? All three of those characters had the elements of a hero, just in a very misguided way.
Again, questioning the value of having that hero model in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. But then of course you got Sheldon, who the way Frankie describes it, kind of heroically saves himself in the end, just gruesomely as well. There's a lot more to be unpacking there. I'm pretty sure.
So, Well, Franklin, it's good to see you. I have not seen you this semester, so it's nice to see you at least virtually.
Thank you. I'm actually going to be talking to Dr. Brown today.
Very good. Very good. Well, hopefully you'll be traipsing through one of my classes soon.
I hope so. I'm looking forward to it.
All right, any other questions for our panelists? Okay. All right, thank you very much to our steadfast audience. And
You had more earlier. They skipped
Yes.
out to avoid the questions.
yeah, probably. Yeah. All right, thank you both so much for
Good
getting
to
on.
see you guys.
See
Take
ya.
care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.